Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Lockwood, and I'm your host for the Inclusion Bites podcast. In this series, I have interviewed a number of amazing people and simply had a conversation around the subject of inclusion, belonging, and generally making the world a better place for everyone to thrive. If you'd like to join me in the future, then please do drop me a line to joe.lockwood@teachangehappen.co.uk. That's SWE changehappen.co.uk. You can catch up with all of the previous shows on iTunes, Spotify, and the usual places. So plug in your headphones, grab a decaf, and let's get going. Today is episode 63, with the title, Only Ourselves Can Free Our Minds. And I have the absolute honour and privilege to welcome Moreen Pascal. Moreen describes herself as an armchair freedom fighter, an inside-outsider. She is also a program manager, a safeguarding adults trainer, and an assertive coach. When I asked Moreen to describe her superpower, she said it's her ability to see issues from all sorts of perspectives, simultaneously and with empathy. Hello, Moreen. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for having me. Honestly, it's a privilege and an honour to be invited to do my soapbox thing. To be invited to talk about issues and situations around the world, around inclusion and belonging. And for me, like we were saying earlier, equality and diversity for me also complements those central values. And just listening to you introduce me and my ramshackle set of job roles and influences, I think altogether they do describe who I am and why I guess I've met you in the first place, why I work for Housing Diversity Network. That's one of the things that I do. As a child, that title, Only Ourselves Can Free Our Minds, I do really hope I'm not misquoting the wonderful Bob Marley, R.I.P. His music was an essential part of the way I was brought up in North London. It says something about my cultural heritage, which is Caribbean. It's also a nod to my parents when they came to this country all those years ago in the 50s. They brought their culture with them, and that reference to insider, outsider is to do with the fact that I had more than one cultural influence going on in my life. And I think this is true for a lot of people who are first, second, third generation, is that you're almost looking at the same situation that somebody who's born in that country with one dimensional culture, if I can put it that way, is only seeing it in one way. So food, take food, classic one. There's food you have at school and there's food you have at home when you're growing up. There's the music you hear when you go out with your friends, and there's the music you hear when you go out to cultural parties, christenings, Christmas events, and so on. This sort of double vision, almost like I would say like a super skill, because you realise that actually when you're growing up, the way we're socialised and normalised into a country, you can only understand how blinkered that is when you have another way of looking at the same situation because of perhaps culture or travel or some other influence that's going on in your life. And I take my hat off to people, and in this particular case, to my parents and all that generation who travelled halfway around the world. And in my parents' case, had never left that island until they came to Britain. And so when they made the decision to leave, it was a huge decision. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to do this podcast with you, because I almost feel, maybe because I'm getting older, I want to pay tribute to all those influences in my life. And actually, it starts with my parents. You know that reference you made to me being, I said it, armchair liberator, armchair freedom fighter. That is definitely a nod to my father, who, when we were growing up as kids, he always talked about the political situation of the world. He didn't just talk about our woes and our challenges. He always connected it with what was going on in Kenya and what was going on in South Africa. And even though I wasn't from South Africa or Kenya, I think at an early age, it developed that kind of political way of looking at things and to show the interconnectivity between things that don't look as if they're connected at all. And and he was like that because he himself, in on the island of Grenada where he was born, um, the island was still part of the British Empire at that time in the 50s. And he was definitely part of the movement, the trade union movement, that was beginning to challenge that kind of cultural hegemony. And his generation of young people um, were very active, and eventually it did lead to Grenada having its first homegrown prime minister rather than the governor general from the UK. So very early on, I'd say the influence of my father, God bless him, has been really important. And I think I've taken that through life, that I look at the struggles around inclusion and belonging through a political lens, and which is why social justice and equality is so important to me. I was a child when, the Race Relations Act, as it was called then, and the Sex Discrimination Act were coming in. I wasn't aware of them, but that's my era, that's my decade, the 70s. And there was lots going on, Joe. I remember watching television, still black and white in those days, and seeing this woman with this enormous afro. I had no idea who she was, but I just remember being awestruck by her and the way she was speaking and her confidence and her posture and her political statements. I was a kid, but I then found out she was Angela Davis. I don't know if you're aware of Angela Davis, part of the sort of Black consciousness movement in America. But this was a time when women weren't at the forefront. They weren't as vocal and loud and confident and knowledgeable like she was. And she was a huge influence on my idea of myself and what you should be concerned about and what was important, and challenging the current mores in British life during the 70s and so on. So from my father to Angela Davis, and then, as I say, Bob Marley with that quote, it's the sense that it's not easy, it's complex. That on the one hand, you're trying to free yourself from a situation of empire, oppression, let's say it, let's get it out, racism. And at the same time, there's also a process that has to begin inside of yourself. So his very clever quote that as a result of that experience of colonies and colonization, there's the act of colonizing your mind, and you almost, because it's so powerful and so pervasive, you almost have to transform yourself inside out, as well as be actively protesting and marching and supporting and being allies with other people. So hence that quote. And I think that's very much the way I approach these issues around thriving in a world that allows each and every one of us to be our full potential. I see it rightly or wrongly through that lens. I don't think it's wrong. I just think it adds to the utensils that we have to unpick what's going on. I think a lot of decisions and the way we live have a political basis to them, but we don't necessarily investigate them or are aware of them. We just think it's how it is, and so tough. But actually, a lot of things can be undone and unravelled if we had the right political awareness, knowledge, structure, and people in place. Hence, hopefully, that explains my armchair liberator bit, meaning that I'm not always storming up and down the streets, but I do support people who do bother to do that. May call me a bit, armchair.
Yeah, I know. I mean, your quote from Bob Marley there. I've just looked it up while you've been talking. It's from Redemption Song, and as we know, Redemption Song is emphatically a protest against discrimination.
Yes.
And the line is, "We're going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, because
Amen.
whilst others may free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind." And I think what you're saying there is you talk about colonization of your mind. Yes, you are free to walk down the street, but there's a lot of other stuff in your heads, in the heads of people around you, that's what you've got to decolonize, if you like. You've got to give yourself that mental freedom and escape that mental slavery, if you like, even
Yeah.
though the shackles have been long since shed.
Amen to that. Absolutely. And it's a hard battle. It's wearing. Let me give you an example. Was it just the other week? Have you heard of the case of Child Q? This is,
Yes, I heard. Yeah, yes.
um, when I was preparing and thinking about doing this podcast with you and becoming really enthusiastic and delighted to have this opportunity to get some stuff off my chest, this would be one of those most recent things that horrified me and kind of, I guess, emotionally, mentally put me back a little bit, even though this case has nothing directly to do with me. But that's the whole point, Joe, is that call me a bit woohoo, but I do feel we are connected. And just because that's happening to somebody's child in Hackney, I believe the school was in London, and for the benefit of your listeners who are not, who don't know what I'm talking about in relation to Child Q, this is a 15-year-old black girl who was on her period, who teachers thought she was on drugs or taking drugs. They smelt something. Um, and if I'm misquoting, forgive me, folks, but you can look this up because it's still live, the case, in terms of the court proceedings, but it happened a couple of years back. She was 15 at the time. The point is, she's a black girl, a minor, in school where it's meant to be a place of safety. I mean, for most people, schools are a safe space. But hey, we all know that's not quite true. And the nub of the story was her own teachers called the police on her because of their suspicion and then left her with the police, who then proceeded to body search her. Was that the right term? She was naked. I haven't heard of something so personally traumatizing for a long time. And when people think, people ask, what is structural racism? For me, that embodies it in a nutshell. That action, that's what it is. It's a situation where you cannot envisage a young white girl. I mean, if it did happen to a young white girl, I think Parliament would be stormed. It's unthinkable. But it
Mm.
seems when it comes to, in this case, I am a black person, so I'm going to talk about black people because I can talk about, from experiences. When it comes to being a black person, that level of abuse, apart from leaving people like myself speechless, because we're just like, here we go again, is, as I say, even within her safe space, in an institution, education, she wasn't actually safe. And the people she was looking to carry out that, is it parentis, when you're at somebody else's care, which teachers carry
Yeah.
out, they let her down badly because they had no right. She was a child, an adolescent, a minor. She had the right to have an adult, have her parents called when the police were called. None of that happened. She was strict. She's on her period, and that's already very personal, excuse me. And then to be strip searched, and then to be, apparently the officers concerned were women on so many levels. I'm not connected to the family. I'm not the parent. I'm not, as a human being, it's horrific. And as I say, for a lot of people, that could only take place because we're not equal. Black, white children are not valued equally. There is no respecting of boundaries. Her parents weren't included. It hurt me to my core. And I'm not a teacher. I wouldn't even describe myself as an equality, diversity, inspiration specialist because I'm not. And that's the irony, Joe, that you get pulled into things, or somebody like me gets pulled into things, even though your profession is something completely different. You cannot ignore, I can't ignore what goes on in other spaces. And you find yourself in this inclusion space because, from a social justice point of view, I'm involved. That's the politics of it. And the luxury of just having a career in engineering or just being a trainer, it feels to me that for a lot of us, we have no choice. We can't just have a job. We have to also be part of the struggle. I can't. I'm not speaking for all black people. How dare I? I can't. I'm speaking for me and a lot of other people who find themselves drawn in, maybe because of our personalities, our star signs. We identify with other humans who suffer, and I think that's been ingrained in me from a very long time. And then the sadness of it, we take two steps forward, and then something like that happens, and I think, oh, right. Then the shooting in Buffalo. I think, how do we do it? How do people get up every day out of bed and carry on when again it's not just the fact that they were black. Let's be absolutely clear about this. It's people just going about their business with shopping. How mundane can you get when you're doing your food shopping? They're going about their business, shopping, getting food in for their family. People are expecting guests. Granny was coming. Next minute, 11 people are shot by. Now, this is controversial. He's described in the media as a white supremacist, domestic terrorist, and I think that's good. I was thinking if this had been somebody of a Muslim background, okay, if it had been reversed, this would be all over the media, all over Twitter, all over wherever it is. And I'm thinking, I'm watching and waiting to see how this is going to be analysed and picked over because I'm not hearing too much about the impact of that at the moment. And again, if people want to ask me what is structural racism is when impacts of action are not valued in the same way because the humans are not valued in the same way. And that's it in a nutshell. And we are where we are. We've made some progress in some areas. And then something like this happens. I'm not American. And yet I'm connected with what's going on because the theme here was this white supremacist, and this is where race comes into it. He said, he filmed what he was doing, and that was the whole point. He wanted to get rid of, or whatever, annihilate, exterminate black people. So for me, being the empathic person that I am, the social justice person that I am, the political person that I am, I just look at this on a human level and think, unless this can only get worse, unless there is a concerted, systemic, joined up, progressive alliance of people, like-minded people to fight this thing, which is so dangerous for lots of groups of people. But I would say to you, Joe, when it starts with one group of people, and in this instance, it was about skin color, this person has in their head that you're not as good as, it then moves on to other groups of people. This is my experience. I've been on the planet quite a long time. When one group of people start being the target of this kind of oppressive, discriminatory, in this instance, racist attack, other groups who are marginalized also they start getting lined up too. Look at Hitler, look at Germany. I came back from a trip from Krakow the other week, and as part of that, we went to Auschwitz. And that was something I'd always wanted to do because I wanted to pay my respects and to see with my own eyes and to hear with my own ears what had happened in Europe during that time. And it's like we haven't learnt much. In some respects, we've moved on a lot. There hasn't been a war in Europe for a long time. But hey ho, Russia and Ukraine. Things, we don't always, it's not always linear. It's kind of, if we're not careful, cyclical, and we have to keep alert and watchful. So doing this with you today, I am both happy to be doing this with you. Having met you, we've spoken before. That's great and that's positive. The other side of me is thinking I'm a bit flat as a result of those two things that have happened. And the connection is strong because, but for the grace of God, that could easily be my family member or somebody, or me. Because the only thing was, they were black. That was it. They hadn't done anything to him. They were just going about their business and they were outside. Mistake number one. It's hurtful. It's difficult. And
There's a massive difference of how people are perceived in what they're doing in the world, in the streets, depending on their skin color. You're talking there. I was thinking back to the January 6th Capitol riots in the US. There were white
right.
people touting automatic weapons, standing on steps in public, armed, like military armed. If those people had been black, the outcome would have been completely different. There would
Tell
have
me.
been snipers, they'd have been shot, they'd have been beaten up, but the white people were kind of rounded up and pushed away, and then they did the investigation afterwards. Had it been black people, there'd have been riot police, truncheons, military arm, and I have no doubt that people would have been shot and killed on the spot. So and that's American. I appreciate that's America. That's not the UK, but we're still, as you've talked about already, the systemic structural racism that exists. That damning report that about the Met Police aren't racist came out. Was it 2 years ago? Whenever 18 months ago, and the whole country laughed and went, "Hang on a minute, how can you seriously say that there isn't structural and endemic racism within many police forces? Maybe individual officers, no, but it's endemic within the structure." And as we've seen from Child Q, racism existed there, which is, I'm pleased to see the officers were suspended and there's been a thorough investigation and child protection has been involved, and hopefully we'll see positive resolution. But the default belief is that white people are good, black people are always up to no good. They're always up, always bad. And that exists in many, many situations, even today in 2022. And I'm sure, I don't know if you take any solace from it, that Cressida Dick eventually resigned or was pushed out when they put their hand up and said, yes, we agree, the Met Police is sexist, it is homophobic, it is racist at its core, and something needs to be done. Because unless we're prepared to stand up and say this, nothing will ever change. And the rate of change, I'm sure you'll be frustrated with, because I think even the World Economic Forum are saying it's going to be 50 to 70 years for even some level of gender equality in the Western world, let alone racial equality, let alone disability equality, LGBTQ plus equality, etc. So we've got a long way to go. And if you don't fit into that straitjacket of normal or typical or on the average of the society, then people are marginalized. They do suffer discrimination in a structural, systemic way.
And I don't want the thing that keeps me going is, I guess, an optimism or positivity. Like a lot of people involved in the kind of work that we do, is if I don't have that belief in humanity, let's go in people, I there's a lot of reason for people to just give up, get depressed, jack it all in. There's so much that's going on that sometimes you have to turn it off. It's disheartening. On the positive side, on the plus side, what I witnessed around Mr. Floyd's killing and how people from all around the world were doing their thing in support, that gave people like myself, a bit older, a lift, especially as they were younger people of all colours. I remember when I used to demonstrate in the 80s, it was very rare to see white people join black people on a march. And I would be marching about a death in custody. That was very common in those days. I was a young person, and people would be arrested and they wouldn't come out alive. People think I make this stuff up. I talk from lived experience, not because it's happened to my family, and I don't operate on that level. I just operate on a sort of community level and a humanity level. But people would be arrested, and then mysteriously they wouldn't be alive when they came out. They didn't even get as far as the courts. And there was one particular case that I was involved in as a young person, the case of Colin Roach. So another reference for people, it's like the recent social history. And I don't think there was a public inquiry. So the family and the community set up an independent one. And I was the administrator on that inquiry. That's one of my things that I did. And I really wish I hadn't seen some of the photographs. And I'm sure there's members of his family still around. But as part of the inquiry, I saw some of the police photographs. I wish I hadn't looked, but you're young and you think you know everything. I still remember, I'm still haunted by looking at those photographs. So that was real for me. So I know it's American and this is the UK, but We have our own versions of some of this stuff. And yet, as I say, on the positive side, looking at what's going on today, 2022, 20 after the killing, Black Lives Matter, and the global support, I still have hope and support that right-minded, like-minded people will still rise to the top. We will make progress. I have to believe that. And on that note, I recently became a non-executive director on a housing association, and it's I don't have the normal background, 15 years an accountant or 20 years as CEO of anything. And but I still went for this position. I was delighted that they said, yeah, we want you on board. I asked them as part of the feedback. I asked the chair, so why did you make this offer? And by the way, I want it, thank you. He said, you did a great interview, right? Meaning that they weren't just doing positive discrimination. They were out there looking for somebody who thought differently about what they were doing. They looked at their own composition, which was mainly white, straight males. They were honest about that. I said, well, if I'm on your board, I can make a difference. I will definitely compliment what you've got going on here. We're so different. I can make a difference. And they were laughing. And I was thinking straight away, perhaps we can work together, because he saw the humour in what I had to say. It didn't work against me when he asked me the question. I was able to be myself. They were able to be themselves. But I made it quite clear that, yeah, there's work to do, because who you have around the table affects the person in the street. It's as simple as that. If you haven't got that diversity of thought and experience, it limits the way you look at things. So that was one of my reasons for putting myself forward. Whatever I said, they liked it anyway. And there I am, probably the first black person of any gender on the board. And so it's a small progress in that regard. Someone has to be first sometimes. And I'm thinking, like I've done in other roles, it would be good for tenants to see, okay, there's, it's a bit more diverse on that board. What's our organisation doing? I think it's good for tenants. I think it's good for suppliers, contractors, the board, staff, just to have a bit of difference on the board psychologically and for people's mental well-being. So we'll see how that goes. But I'm really happy that they took the argument that, they were looking for something different, not the same old. You don't need to, at HDN and other organisations, we've done a lot of work around the composition of boards, and I know you've been involved yourself. And on the one hand, we recognise that things are changing so fast, the pandemic threw everything up in the air, and yet our way of approaching how we should staff decision-making vehicles is not keeping up. It's not keeping up with the rate of change and the disruption that's going on, and the kind of agile thinking that you need. By all means, you need people who can do that banking, treasury stuff. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who can help with the instability of the situations that we find ourselves in society, rather than just thinking you do a plan for 30 years, which is, what housing associations do. You have this 30-year plan. Nobody knows what's going to happen next year, and yet we act as if we know what's going to happen in 30 years. But the reality is, look what's happened in the world in the last couple of years. If it's taught us anything, we need more people around the table who can help us solve stuff. We need to be less arrogant about the future. We need to be much more respectful about the planet where we live, where none of us control or own. Excuse me. And there should be a lot more challenge to this idea that corporations and big conglomerates can do what the hell they like with the planet when it doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the people who live on it. That's all of us. And I think, that's, in my own humble opinion, maybe not so humble, is how our thinking has to change. All these certainties that we've had in the past, we need to get rid of them. And it's not happening fast enough as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying about board diversity in many public sector organisations, including even private housing associations. I know the National Housing Federation, the Institute of Housing. There's white papers come out looking at where D&I, board diversity, is very high on the agenda. If you look at the recent 2020 Charity Commission guidance, D&I, board diversity, is very high on the Charity Commission's agenda as well. Because, as you well know, we need to have lived, relatable experience that matches the lived experience of the service users, of the tenants, as the beneficiaries of the charity or housing association. Because we need to start rebuilding communities. And if you don't have any association with the communities you're trying to support, how can you provide resources and responses? Antisocial behaviour that goes on in the communities. Housing associations are reducing tenancies to now 5 to 7 years instead of lifetime tenancies. That has a massive impact on how people treat their community. They don't see it as a house for life anymore. They see it as a house for now. And of course, people aren't going to value where they're living in the same way if it just feels transient. So I think there's a huge amount that representation can do of lived experience in public sector and the private sector to make sure that people are being heard. Otherwise, we're designing systems. We go back to this, I think, how we started it. We're designing systems for the incumbent privilege of society that are supposed to cope with the needs of the minority and the excluded. How can there be any relation between the lived experience and knowing what people need in their communities? And I think we have to value lived experience far more than I've done this in the past. And I think that's fantastic. The fact that not only have you been through a board diversity training program yourself, an NED trainee program, but you've also got a role in a housing association that is forward thinking and actually starting to understand their responsibility.
I really was impressed with them. It sounds ironic because I wasn't being patronising when I thought, yes, that's the sort of organisation I would like to be associated with. But let me get one thing absolutely clear around the lived experience piece. We don't need anybody doing us any favours, us. And even the term marginalised, it's still, it's in relation to the people, the groups in power. We're only marginalised because there is somebody who's dominating a situation. You know, it's not a badge that we're wearing, that there's something wrong with the way we think and operate. It's to do with power. So that, hence the marginality, right? So I'm absolutely clear, having been born here, there's a whole swathe of people that we don't take advantage of their ability. So let me explain something, because I'm working on this hypothesis. So I'm delighted, and I got there. I still feel, hopefully, mainly on my own merit and strength of argument. However, I also acknowledge that I had to probably imitate some of the ways in which these white straight males get onto boards. I had to imitate how they do that, and that is use your connections. It's taken a long time, but normally marginalised people don't have connections. I have finally learned if I've got to get anywhere, I have to use my connections. I never did that because you're marginalised. You're on the outside anyway. So what connections, apart from the people you know? Professionally, use your connections, network, learn. In my case, I did our board excellence program, not the board diversity one, because my background's not housing. My background is third sector, charity, community. So I didn't have the language of housing, but I know I'm more than capable of learning it. I was encouraged by a colleague to put myself on the course. I was sponsored by another housing association, I think out of their corporate social responsibility, learned what I had to learn so that when I went into an interview situation, I could speak social housing. The language, the territory, and that's what the board excellence program definitely gave me, was that. And I set myself that goal that within a couple of months of getting that, I would apply and get this role. But I learned through doing the program, use your connections, stay up to date, know your stuff enough, not expert, but know enough about your stuff to operate credibly as a board member. Of course, I'm just starting this journey and I expect to be learning. I'm a learning specialist. I'm happy to learn. I'm always learning in a way that's worked against me because I never focus on one thing. I'm always learning lots of different things. But the important point I want to make about how people are left out, not just about race or colour or even class, it's stereotypes about who is fit enough to make decisions and work together, right? It's a stereotype.
The culture
So
fit, the face fit,
it is about face
you've
fit.
been to the right school, you've worked in a similar organisation before, had a similar, yeah.
And I know there's comfort in that because I recognise that so we recruit each other and it's comfortable. I get that. I'm a human. I see that. I'm not gonna, but it needs to be challenged because I think it's not always helpful to the problems that we have now. They're huge. The challenges we have now, and having the same order response to it is not working. We can see that climate. The planet's in a mess. And here, speaking internationally, it's not just about the UK government or the American one. Is that you tend to find these elite groups in all countries. You know, who run countries. That's what they do, and that's why they're. And I'm saying politically that needs to be challenged much more. So this is where it's more than just race or gender. It's about who's in charge and the mess they've made. We need to stop allow them to make this mess and have a different kind of energy in the room. But come back to locally in the UK, in our own country, I think that because of our school system, where you have different varieties of schools, which is a bit different from my colleagues in Europe, who I know I used to work closely with. We've got a private system, state system, church system. We've got all sorts of systems, which aids and abets this kind of fragmentization and elitism. And people in the middle don't get a chance to, I think we've gone backwards. They don't get a chance to influence what goes on. So I would say, even in government, you have less people from working class backgrounds, even in the Labour Party, than you used to. When the trade union movement was much more powerful than it is, and it was called working men's colleges, those kind of places. I mean, I know they weren't perfect, but it gave people another outlet to get that real education to operate in a political context. All those things are gone, you might say, rightly so, but it's also had a sort of negative impact on people, just, the average person in the street, what I would call working class in a positive sense. I consider myself working class. So I'm not being demeaning when I say that. It's about an attitude towards life. It's a mindset. Um, and so even the Labour Party has become narrower in some respects as we all become middle class, if I'm not contradicting myself. And here I'm talking about culture. I'm talking about cultures that the predominant culture is middle class. Even when you're not middle class, the culture that predominates, that is meant to be seen as better, permeates everything. How you recruit, how you dress for board to be a board member, it's everywhere. How you style your home. Um, that's the culture that dominates as being the one that we should be, imitating, and that has an impact on all sorts of people. Um, and I'm saying politically, there's a kind of diversity that's kind of reduced, even though you've got more women in parliament or more black people. Where there's a kind of another narrowing down that's happened over the years, but that's just my opinion. More than happy to be challenged on it.
I sniggered there as you were talking because I remember probably about a year or 18 months ago, I was doing some work with HDN, and I was presenting to the board of a housing association, and I've been working with this housing association for a few months at various things, and I've been sort of pushed forward, nominated to present a report to the board, and the person I was liaising with was one of the junior board members on HR or something like that, and she sort of subtly said to me, "Will you be wearing what you're wearing now?" And I said, "Well, what's the dress code of the board?" She said, "Well, just up your game a little bit," sort of thing. And I thought,
Ooh.
yeah, you could see my collarbone and my shoulders, and you're now telling me how I was dressed. This is a woman. I mean, I did
Mm.
plan on wearing a dress, despite the fact you could only see my shoulders.
Mm.
What I'm wearing now is a white t-shirt. I mean, if I told you this was a wedding dress, you could probably believe me. It's white and it's a t-shirt, but it could well be a modern style wedding dress. So there's still this expectation about how you show up and how you look.
Mm.
It's respectful. It adds value to your presence. All these various things. You're judged by so many things, and even on a Zoom call, you're judged by how you show up to a virtual meeting.
And this is the contradiction for me, inside, outsider. I get all of those things. I also fight against it because
Mm.
all I'm interested in is the content of what you have to say. I really am. That's all I'm listening for when I'm talking to someone. And yet, what you're saying there, what I've just been referring to, is the appearance of things often is more important than what's actually going on. So if you look respectable, if you look like you're part of us, sometimes that seems to have more weight than the intelligence and the competence of what's being said. Nobody's scrutinizing that because the person who's saying it looks the part, as I call it. They look
Mm.
in charge, they look sensible, they look. And I'm thinking that's why people get away with murder because it's a bit like our present government. They sound and look the part, and yet they can carry on making incredible mistakes that you could never make in another, not in a corporate setting or a public sector setting without being sacked. But they sound the part, they look the part. Call me shallow, but I think that that's one of my bugbears is that we're a very shallow society. Depth seems to have lost, given way to appearance and superficiality. I don't
I've
know.
realised I think I have more trust in people
Mm,
that are more authentic, and that doesn't mean wearing a suit and tie, wearing a dress that looks, or wearing a dress with a jacket and heeled shoes or things like this. I always think, well, does this person look authentic? Do they look comfortable in their own skin? Are they comfortable in front of me? That
mm,
means far more than someone who's squashed themselves into this formal suit of armor, the corporate image. And I think some of the things on the COVID, doing the COVID announcements on 5 o'clock every night, it was just three suits and a woman in a dress with a jacket on. It was kind of thinking, I want to see someone who's prepared to take their tie off, not have a jacket on, actually say, look, here's what I believe, not kind of the corporate line. And I think, but then we become disruptors, we become subversive, we become activists, we become outliers, on the edge of society. And
yeah.
isn't this the problem where we go back to power, privilege? They're scared of outsiders because, and I don't mean everybody. I'm just
Mm,
fundamentally,
mm,
privilege protects privilege. It's the way we do things. Only we know how to do things properly. Only
mm,
we know how to behave. How can we trust anyone who's an weak, an outsider, a lower class person?
mm.
How can we trust someone who hasn't been to Eton? Because what do they know? We think far bigger than they can ever think. And this is the perception, isn't it? And you bring someone who's prepared to be, actually, I don't want to play by your rules. Everyone gets really scared. They get to their panic zone. This person's a hand grenade. What's going to go on next? And they're worried about disruption, aren't they?
I couldn't agree more. Again, so much been going on in the media. Jake, the young footballer who came out as gay
Yes.
recently,
Yes.
is it Championship? I don't think it's Premiership, but anyway, it's one of those ships. And the irony, okay, the forces that kept him, that he's fought against, obviously, he's 17, I can't believe, but anyway, the strength of mind and purpose he must have to do what he did, okay? But ironically, the forces that in football that stop that, because we all know this idea there are no gay footballers is a load of nonsense, but
Mm.
it has to be maintained because the image of the game and so on by the powers that be, and that includes some of the footballers. And the irony is that, because we've got this macho image, or I imagine this macho image that football's a man's game, and and then to have somebody come out as gay, we can't have that because it kind of contradicts we can't line up the possibility that somebody can play football and be gay at the same time. It's like the two don't go. Whatever the forces are that stop people from coming out in sports, but football in particular, then you have this young, what I would call disruptor, just come out, just do it. I'm 17, I've got nothing to lose. And then he would probably be seen as being, the prejudice is he's weak. Gay, to be gay equals weak, equals effeminate, equals, it's the opposite of macho, masculine. like he said, toxic masculinity, because football has this other perception in the people who follow it. And the irony is, again, his behaviour, there is more strength in what he's done, because he knows, he said himself, he's probably opened himself up for attention that he doesn't want, negative attention.
Mm.
And for me, the ability to be an outlier that he's done just now, because he is an outlier for sure, because he's the second or third person in 30 years to have done what he's done. I'm seeing him as that's the strong individual. That's the person with who I'd want to be sat around my table helping me make decisions. This person has demonstrated to me they're fearless, they think for themselves, etc., etc. But he'd probably be the last person, because of the prejudice, because of these years of toxic masculinity. He's the last person who's going to be invited to, sit around the table and help make decisions. But the irony is, he has more courage, foresight, modernity, whatever you want to call it, in his little finger, compared to the people who keep the FA propped up. And you have this contradiction that outliers are exactly the people you often need to move things along, to open things up. And yet it's this great big drama because one teenage young person, has come out and said he's gay. And it's a big deal in the media. I mean, it's something to celebrate, but it's also a reflection how sad we are and how slow progress is at the same time. So it's one of those events again, another one, I must stop listening to the radio and stuff, where I'm delighted on the one hand, but I'm also sad on the other that progress is so slow.
I
And
don't know if
we're
you
in
watch.
denial as well about what goes on. Just making that connection with, the power dressing and all of that, and this armory, that we're almost in denial that we're just humans and we have to put on this armory just to get us through a meeting and to be convincing and be taken seriously. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. There's no
Yeah.
authenticity there. So I agree with you. Yes.
Now, I was watching. I don't know if you watched the series, Freeze the Fear with Wim Hof.
Yes.
I
Yes.
was watching the other night, and when they were doing the jump off the bridge thing, and I was watching Professor Green when he was at the top there, and he was seeking inside himself, and he decided out of all of them, he was the only one not to jump off the bridge, and he
Okay.
climbed back over. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember thinking, wow, everyone else done it. Why couldn't you? Then I listened to him. He said, jumping would have been the easiest thing to do. By not jumping,
Mm.
it was a tougher decision for him because it would have been easier to go with peer pressure. It would have been easier to do what was expected, easier because everyone else has to walk back off and say, hang on a minute, I don't need to do this for you. And actually, I don't need to do it for me. I
Yeah.
value my life. I want to be a parent. I want to be a husband. I want to continue my life. And I have a responsibility to people who love me not to put my life in danger. And I thought, wow, you're
Wow.
so right. We go along with what's expected for
Mm-hmm.
fear of letting people down, because it's easier. And then when we
Mm-hmm.
stop and question it, think, actually, the most important thing I could do here is what feels right for me. And that takes more strength to swim against the tide than just to go with the flow. And I think that's what you're saying here about
I
Jake
am.
Daniels, who plays for Blackpool, which is in, as you say, he played in the Championship the other week. He came for his first appearance. It's so easy to go with the flow because that's what society expects.
It's so easy because you don't want that attention. You don't want to stir things up. Yeah, it's like keeping your head low, almost down, and therefore not being able to be yourself. And I think that's what I mean in the introduction that you did around me. Is sometimes I feel exactly like an outsider. I mean, I'm an outsider looking in. That's what it feels like sometimes, to not be part of the mainstream. But I don't necessarily see that as a burden. I sometimes see that as an advantage, and that's what I mean about being able to see things in more. If you're in the circle, you're looking out into the edges. If you're on the edge, you're looking beyond the edge and you're looking into the circle. That's how I would describe it. And I think part of freeing your mind is to stop allowing the dominant culture to tell you that what you are bringing to the table is not valuable. So actually, being a minority is valuable because you're bringing a different disruptive perspective.
Mm.
Whereas if you accept the status quo, being a minority is something down, negative, disadvantaged. No, sometimes it is, but no. Sometimes being a minority means that your thinking is acute because you be in those spaces where you're not included. Equally, not being part of the mainstream brings a creativity because to survive, you have to think outside. I do like that expression. I'm not going to lie. You have to think outside the box. Go against the grain because you're not part of the grain anyway. In my case, so you often find that you're doing something a bit different because you're not part of the grain, but that can sometimes feel very good. And so, Professor Green's what you've just described about what he did on the program, for me, that's also about having the courage. I used to call it assertiveness, but and I still will use that term. Part of that is to have the courage to be your own person, even when other people are contradicting you, going against you, is to have that strength of conviction that, like you said, he doesn't owe the cast or the program makers anything. He was still being himself, as well as an entertainer with an agent and getting paid, whatever it is. He was still being himself, which is the other roles that he plays. And he was bringing that to the show. And that's what, for me, is being authentic. You're not putting on an armor, you're not taking it off, you're not being this for somebody else to fit in. And I think in a way that's kind of like a definition of struggle. That's how you disrupt things, is having the strength of mind, even when the forces, the power forces are incredible. Some people have been sacked for being themselves. Some people have lost their lives for being themselves. It's very courageous. I know I'm not fighting any particular, I'm doing it in the luxury of my own armchair, but I'm with those people. Those people, this is controversial. Let's see what you think of this, Joe. The climate change people who lie on the motorways.
XR, Extinction Rebellion, yeah.
Yes, yes. Why I won't personally do it myself, because I'd be too concerned about the police today, and the cold, whatever. I totally have due respect for them and I support them. Even though a lot of people are anti them because they get in the way of cars and people get into places and stuff like that, I'm with them morally because they're saying, wake up, you're all sleeping, people. We've got to do something dramatic to get you to pay attention. And I get what they're trying to do. So even if I had been driving along and they were doing that, I would just swallow it down. I would, because they've got nerve and maybe privilege. Yeah. When the police come, perhaps they don't get, but actually some of them have been thrown into the van. But I'm not so sure what would happen to me. I need to be alive. I need to stay around a bit longer.
Yeah.
But I totally support what they're doing, even though it's annoying to a lot of people.
If you look at, I saw something in the news yesterday. I'm not sure if it's going ahead, but there's a planned tube strike for Jubilee weekend. So if you're an unsatisfied worker with a union or with a body that represents you, you have the power in your work to be able to influence your employer's behaviour and decisions by using strike action, by using disruption within your workplace to draw home your cause. If you're protesting about the planet,
yes,
the only course of action you have is to go on strike to impact other people. And that means closing a bridge. That means disrupting people's lives, blocking fuel tankers. If the fuel tankers went on strike, people go, well, that's okay. But if the Extinction Rebellion blockade, that's seen as not okay. Hang on a minute. If you want to protest against the planet, you should have the same rights as somebody who wants to protest against the employer in a way. I don't agree with violence. I don't agree with anything that's violent. But I do agree people have the right to create a disruption that highlights a point within the law. And let's not get into the change of the laws we're looking at and the Social Justice Act, preventing people from protesting. I think providing people act within the law as it was, I'm not sure about the new law, but as it was, I think we should all have the right to stand up and be counted. We don't live in a dictatorship. We don't live in a state where the people can't speak. especially now with social media, everybody can be a publisher. Everyone's an author. Everyone's an activist.
Yeah.
Everyone can get a Twitter following. Suddenly, you can be an influencer in your, as you said, in your own armchair in your kitchen.
Mm.
So we all have the power to create our cause. And one thing I realized is I spent best part of 50 years of my life not having a specific identity. I just was. I fitted into the majority box. I fitted into the privilege box.
Mm.
And it's not since I gender transitioned at the age of 52 that I realized that suddenly I do have an identity. I do have to think about how I fit into the planet now. I do have to think about what I meet, who I am in relation to other people, which I'd never thought about before. I've also realized that the doors that used to open really easily
Mm.
don't seem to open in the same way as they did before. So whether it's because I'm in my 50s now, I'm in 57, whether it's because I'm a woman, and whether it's because I'm trans, or whether it's because I'm LGBT perceived, or maybe I'm a bit too queer to fit into any beauty standards of gender.
Mm.
Maybe it's those things, or maybe it's just because I mix with different people now. I don't know. But I've noticed there's more friction in opportunities than there used to be. But
Mm.
what I have found is more camaraderie is the wrong word. More empathy and compassion with other people who, as you say, marginalized by society, not
Mm.
marginalized as a person.
No,
Yeah, we're
absolutely.
marginalized by the privilege.
Yeah.
Completely agree with that. So I find more camaraderie within the marginalized, the outliers, the on the edges,
Mm.
and I
Mm.
find that completely powerful. And I would never have had conversations like this with you and other people I've met had I been in my own ivory tower, not looking out and seeing what's going on in the world. And I think people try to weaponize the word woke. To me,
Mm.
I'm proud to be woke. I'm a woke. I'm woken up to the issues of social justice, the issues of the planet, the issues that are going on in the world. I'm not perfect. I could do more. I'm not sitting here putting myself in a pedestal saying I'm a wonderful person these days. But my direction of travel is being more awake to what's going on in the world. And I want to learn more about it, not push back and go, hang on a minute, you're threatening my space.
I just feel like saying amen to that. And like you just said, we probably we us two would never have met if for the same reason you've just outlined. You know, this space that we're in. As I say, I'm not a specialist. I'm not an expert around EDI. Mine is call me Sunday school. You know, I just want everyone to be happy. I just want everybody. Nobody owns this planet. No one's in charge. Call me a hippie. I just want everyone to be happy and to the best of our ability. But there's so much in the way of that. And that's why some of us are drawn to this space while also trying to have our own lives. You know what I mean, Joe? Is that you're contributing to that part of you, but you also just want to be yourself, which is like loafing around watching telly. Do you know what I mean? It's yeah, as I say, it can be wearying sometimes when stuff still happens and you just feel for people. But we can't let up. There's too much work to be done. But let's just get this straight also. We're not being paid favours here. It's about opening up the panorama, the mosaic of human talent there is that we've been in denial about because the way our society is set up, it's to keep certain types of talent and ability wrapped up and only give space to a certain, and that's to all of our disadvantage. But the other thing I just want to say before, you know, in terms of the things I do, I was thinking, what is the connection between all of them? Because they seem so disconnected, but actually they are connected. So when I'm doing safeguarding training, this is for people who work with people who could be victims of other people's abuse, you know, so people with perhaps physical or learning disabilities because of age or dementia, or they are vulnerable not in and of themselves, but to people who may wish to exploit that. And so safeguarding for me is also an extension of the equality, diversity and inclusion piece because it recognises that for some people, have you seen that wonderful diagram about the difference is in order to level up the playing field, we have to put in training with the staff who work with and deliver services to people who are more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation because of who they are. And for me, that is part of EDI. It's recognizing and seeing they exist rather than in the olden days, Victorian times, shove people in a home and forget about them. We've moved on from that, so thank God for that. So for me, there's a connection with that. Becoming a board non-executive director for me is also about EDI, not only because of who I am and the difference I'm bringing to the table. It's putting my money where my mouth is I've been moaning about where decisions are made. And so I'm putting myself up for being part of decision-making processes. It's lower level than the government, but it's still, housing associations have a great influence on people's lives. Like I've heard you talk about, your home is a huge factor in your well-being and the way you see yourself. So that's that connection. I also believe I'm into mentoring and the support that none of us get to anywhere without the support of other people. And I've been a keen advocate of mentoring for a very long time before I joined Housing Diversity Network. And the mentoring was always about supporting young people. You know, that stage where you're still becoming yourself or not, you know, that awkward period in our lives that a lot, some of us have easier transitions, others of us, it's very troublesome. And I used to be running a mentoring program that put the most unlikely people together with teenagers. And that taught me something too, that when you support a young person, the gift that you're giving that young person, and I'm saying that as the person who was managing the scheme, not as the mentor. So I can big up those mentors, these random members of the community. So one of my favourite pairings was a retired older gentleman, middle class, cuffly, blah, 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 head of HR, Dubai, flying around the world, paired him with a 14-year-old boy, single parent, mum's from South Africa. You couldn't get more dissimilar two people. But the beauty of mentoring is I know that this mentor, because I recruited him, was humane. Humane, had the time, wanted to give back. I have an individual here who's talented, and they usually are, aren't they? Naughty people, naughty kids. Multi-talented, but totally without direction, lost. Put these two together, the magic that happened, the long and short of it is, that young person is now running his own business. And yes, of course, the influence of his family and friends may have come into it, but I know for sure the influence of that mentor was huge because he said so. And for me, this is where, the upside of the work that we do, there are still small, wonderful gains happening, not always with EDI on the label, but it's the action. That particular white man, he wasn't seeing himself as an EDI warrior, but he recognized that he'd had certain advantages in life and this person hasn't got any. And I think he saw a little bit of himself, and that was a mischievous side in him. The two did fantastic work together. And for me, that story is as much about inclusion and social justice as the big things. It doesn't always have to be a big action. It's a mindset. It's about knowing who your tribe are and who just wants good for people. And I think I would include that mentor in that group. He just wanted good for somebody else. And he wasn't fazed by a young, black student. He wasn't like, oh, what do I do? It's like reverse, he was happy to go into that space. But that's also about mindset that we've been talking about. And sometimes the mindset can be influenced by exposure to people, or maybe you've always had that mindset. You just didn't know it until you've been given that opportunity. So I just wanted to throw that in because it's just a reflection of who I am as an individual and where I get my influences from. And I carry that community thing with me everywhere I go, that whatever you're doing, for me, it should have an impact somewhere or relevance to the community, the people out there, especially the most vulnerable people in society. It should have some benefit. Otherwise, I'm not interested. So that's why.
Fantastic. And I think on that note, that's amazing. So thank you so much. I mean, I can't believe it's been over an hour we've been chatting away, and we're going to carry on for In fact, I'm pleased we're going to be meeting up in person in a couple of weeks' time at
We
the
are.
think tank in Birmingham, aren't we? So it'd be
Yeah.
great to have spend some more time together and chat more. But no, it's been really insightful. I've loved to hear your perspective and your armchair activism and your inside outsider perspective on things. No, it's stimulated a lot in my head as well. So, Maureen, how can people get hold of you if they'd like to take some if they'd like to reflect on this conversation?
Oh, I'd love to connect with people, like-minded people just, curious and nosy, whatever. LinkedIn. So you've got my name. I don't think there are that many people who've got my name in the world, so I'm quite easy to find on LinkedIn. And maybe
Do you want
Joe,
to
you can
spell it out? Because you don't
M
spell
O.
Maureen
Yeah, yeah,
in a
right.
traditional
It's
way,
spelled
do you?
like Dory. Yeah, it's not spelled in the Irish way. So it's Moren, first name, and then my surname, family name, is Pascal, Pascal, as in the French philosopher. For those who
Oh,
know that. Yes.
I was thinking
Mathematician
of
as well.
programming language.
That's
So I'm a
right, the
computer person.
mathematician,
The
Pascal.
programming language, yeah,
Yes, yes.
yeah, yes. So that's my IT. I know. I suppose maybe that was named after the philosopher. I suppose maybe.
Yes. I have no
Who
idea
knows?
how I got that name, but here we are. That's another
No,
podcast.
podcast. I know how I've got my name. So yeah, I had the luxury of picking my own name. So yeah, I thought
What,
we'd just get
Lockwood?
given them.
Lockwood, no,
Yeah.
not Lock. Really?
Oh, yeah, I picked both my names. That's a story for another day as well. I
Oh,
made my entire name up. It's yeah, it's not my
oh
family name
wow.
at all. So
Oh
anyway,
wow.
it's podcast about you. So let's if someone can interview me and ask me that question another day. So thank you so much. As Maureen just said, yeah, LinkedIn is a great place to get in contact. Search for Maureen Pascal. You'll find her on LinkedIn all over the place. So yeah, and so a huge thanks to you, the listener, for tuning in, for getting this far, for staying to the end. Absolutely fantastic. If you're not already subscribed, please do subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, the usual places for future episodes of the Inclusion Bites podcast. That's BITES. Please tell your friends, tell your colleagues. Please share this episode if you've enjoyed it. I've also a number of other exciting guests already lined up that I'm sure you'll be equally inspired by over the next few weeks and months. And of course, if you'd like to be a guest, please let me know. And I'd also welcome feedback and suggestions on how I can improve the show. Please email me to joe.lockwood@teachingtohappen.co.uk. And finally, my name is Joanne Lockwood. It's been an absolute pleasure to host this podcast for you today. Catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.